Male socialization!
And while we should be highly critical of the message that these boys receive, as well as the messengers that profit off of it, I want us to again empathize with the need for boys to have avenues that help them make sense of the world around them in their youth. A paper published here, because I left it off the script, tells us that research on identity development indicates that men are more likely to go through phases of what's called identity foreclosure, which means they adopt the socially expected and enforced ideology of what they are and what they should be. Conversely, women and girls were more likely to go through phases of identity moratorium or exploration of who they are or might be, or they go through what's called achievement and confirmation of an identity that they choose for themselves.
Identity foreclosure is a psychological term that describes one of the key steps young people experience in the process of finding a sense of self. In this stage, adolescents may adopt different traits and qualities from friends and relatives but have not settled on their own. An identity moratorium is one step in the process of finding a sense of self. It is a period of active searching for one's occupational, religious, ethnic, or other form of identity to determine who they really are. It is an identity crisis as part of the quest of teens and tweens to find themselves. Identity achievement is when they're able to sort out who they want to be and what their life's purpose is. They realize what their priorities are. The crisis is defined as a period of identity development during which the individual is exploring alternatives. Commitment is a person's investment in the identity. The four categories are listed below. Diffusion is the status of individuals who have not yet experienced a crisis or made any commitments. Not only are they undecided about occupational and ideological choices, but they are very likely to show little interest in such matters. Foreclosure would be the status of individuals who have made a commitment but not experienced a crisis. This occurs most often when parents hand down commitments to their adolescents, usually in an authoritarian way before adolescents have had a chance to explore different approaches, ideologies, and vocations on their own. Moratorium is the status of individuals who are in the midst of a crisis but whose commitments are either absent or only vaguely defined, and achievement status of individuals who have undergone a crisis and made a commitment.
And if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense when you look at how the way that patriarchy limits boys' understanding of what a boy or a man can and could be, which limits their ability to actualize themselves outside of the framing of masculinity, the classic phrase that masculinity is a cage.
It sounds like that the socialization that AMAB individuals receive can be responsible for the ways that they come to understand their identity. Thus, I would argue that trans-femme individuals who went through a long period of male socialization would relate similarly to the ways that cis men are forced into an idea of what a man is under patriarchy, white supremacy, Christian fundamentalism, hierarchies, essentially. Now, FD signifier gives an example.
For an easy example of this, consider the way that bisexual men are treated when seeking out female partners versus the way that bisexual women are treated when seeking out male partners. By those bisexual men breaking the unspoken contract about what appropriate masculinity is supposed to be, aka not gay, there are lots of women who will never give them the time of day, but might also consider themselves feminists at the same time, which, yeah, that doesn't work.
The TLDR is that bisexual men are demonized for their attraction in both sexes, while bisexual women are encouraged, sexified, objectified by the very same attractions and actions. I would also like to add to this, the public reactions to masculine women versus to feminine men also supports this hypothesis. While society at large often doesn't look very positively at either masculine women or feminine men, often public reaction to a butch, queer, gender nonconforming, visibly AFAB individual is less emphasized than the same reaction to an effeminate man, visible queer or trans individual who is visibly AMAB.
As it makes it possible for someone to start out just wanting to build some muscle or learn how to talk to girls or searching for their favorite anime character and end up arguing for things like enforced monogamy, sex redistribution, or that women should be denied the right to vote. The scary and hard thing to understand is that, like most social ills, the worst parts of the manosphere stem from a very valid and very universal sense of anguish in men. And we have to contend with and process this. And the manosphere in various ways offers the false promise of fixing this problem, of making you a man so great that you'll definitely get the dividend you've always wanted. The promise of giving you a map to be the main character that you've always wanted to be. This messaging works because these boys and men, whether they're edgelords or good-looking petite bourgeois boys of relative privilege, feel the squeeze, feel the sense of existential dread, and they want to address it. They want to address what are actually the failures and limitations of patriarchy under capitalism with performing patriarchy under capitalism.
FD signifier is talking about how many men are searching for their identity and they end up turning online to find out what they need to be. And in this process of trying to address the problems of the world that they live in, they end up participating within that same world. And as a result, it's very easy to get sucked up in online extremist pipelines as you're just trying to figure out how to fit within the world as your positionality, of your characteristics.
And we have men from Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, and soon to be Gen Alpha, as the oldest of them are entering puberty and they're going to start Googling shit on YouTube and TikTok. And they're going to be grappling with the concept of performing masculinity and fearing the possibility of failing at it and suffering numerous consequences, or succeeding and suffering other consequences. And that's one thing I also want to get across here, is that much of the manosphere historically and now is built upon a fear response. As boys, we fear that poor performance of masculinity can contribute to bullying and ostracism, which it does. As men, we fear that it will lead to low prospects for intimate partnership and professional success, which it does. Then for a lot of men who ostensibly do perform masculinity effectively, unless they're at the top of the food chain, they will still be susceptible to the harms of late capitalism in the form of exploitative and dehumanizing work, low wages, poor health practices, etc.
Socialization of children has a large effect on the way that they view the world. From Lumen Learning, socialization. Children learn at a young age that there are distinct expectations for boys and girls. Cross-cultural studies reveal that children are aware of gender roles by age 2 or 3. At 4 or 5, most children are firmly entrenched in culturally appropriate gender roles. Children acquire these roles through socialization, a process in which people learn to behave in a particular way as dictated by societal values, beliefs, and attitudes. Mimicking the actions of significant others is the first step in the development of a separate sense of self. Mead, 1934. Recall that according to Mead's theory of development, children up to the age of 2 are in the preparatory stage, in which they copy actions of those around them, and then the play stage, between ages 2 and 6, when they play pretend and have a difficult time following established rules, and then the game stage, ages 7 and up, when they can play by a set of rules and understand the different roles. Like adults, children become agents who actively facilitate and apply normative gender expectations to those around them. When children do not conform to the appropriate gender role, they may face negative sanctions such as being criticized or marginalized by their peers. Though many of these sanctions are informal, they can be quite severe. For example, a girl who wishes to take karate classes instead of dance classes may be called a tomboy and face difficulty gaining acceptance from both male and female peer groups. Boys, especially, are subject to intense ridicule for gender nonconformity. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about Charles Cooley's concept of the looking glass self. A few key takeaways are that the looking glass self, first coined by Charles Cooley, describes how one's self or social identity is dependent on one's appearance to others. This initial theory was based on Cooley's observations of childhood social development. The reactions of others to ourselves, they provide us with feedback about ourselves of the most direct sort. Cooley, along with other members of the symbolic interactionist school, such as George Herbert Mead, argued that a child could not develop a sense of self in the absence of others to reflect that self back. According to Mead, interactions with others serve to form self-identity in 3 steps. People imagine how they appear to other people. People imagine how others are, thus judging them based on appearance and how they present themselves, and people imagine how others feel about them based on the judgments that they make. Cooley emphasized the individual's autonomous role in deciding which judgments they pay attention to in identity formation, as well as in controlling and evaluating the responses of others. Drawing from his observations of his own daughter as she developed her ability to use the looking glass self, Cooley noted that children are especially incentivized to learn how to use the looking glass self well, as it helps them in a competition for care from members of their primary group, like their family. The self grows as it interacts with more and more people. To Cooley, one can only become truly human through social experience. On the face, it may appear that the individual is passive, constantly shaped by others' impressions and judgments. However, Cooley does not see the self as a one-way internalization of interactions. Instead, people play an active role in shaping how others think about them. Cooley does not see the self as a one-way internalization of interactions. Instead, people play an active role in shaping how others think about them. This conflicts with the fact that the primary caregivers of an individual do have a unique opportunity to shape the individual. The impressions and judgments that you receive from your primary caregivers are actively influencing your thoughts and actions and judgments for the rest of your life. They are the ones giving you these impressions and judgments before you've even had a chance to really come to terms with how you feel about something. Because people are aware that others are perceiving, reacting to, and judging them, they attempt to shape the impressions that they give others. For example, someone may brag about how much alcohol they have consumed over the course of a weekend to their friends, but make a concerted effort to hide this information from their employer. In particular, Cooley examined pride and shame. For Cooley, both emotions arise from self-monitoring, considering them to be basic social emotions. In this note, Cooley points out that individuals can mask in situations to maintain an image or boost their perception or reactions to themselves. I notice this when I will talk to male-presenting people in private versus in public, and also from the way that I used to interact with people in public versus in private. There's a lot of bravado and social checking in groups that is absent in DMs and one-on-one conversations that may be noticed by other people as well. One's perceptions of judgments can be highly inaccurate. For example, on a dance floor, many people who see themselves as good dancers may be in fact perceived as bad dancers, but will nonetheless react as if they are good dancers. While individuals' self-image are shaped by others, this only happens through the mediation of their own minds. People must depend on their imagination, either thinking how others may react or observing others' responses and connecting these two inferences about the working of another's inner mind. What Cooley is saying here is that if you believe that you're a good dancer, you're going to believe that everybody else sees you as a good dancer unless they do something that makes you feel like you're not a good dancer. They may say you're an awful dancer, but if they don't do that, you're going to look at them and be like, I'm a great dancer. They think I'm a great dancer. We're all having a great time. We're having a great dance time. In this same note, I would imagine that many people who find themselves as AMAB individuals who are queer or gender nonconforming internalize many attributes that are negative about themselves due to the deviance from the norm and the threat of deviating from the norm. Goffman's The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. Another prominent and influential account of the self in sociology comes from Erving Goffman's The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. Although Goffman never explicitly mentions the looking glass self, Goffman, like Cooley, focused on embarrassment as a social emotion. Here, Goffman uses the imagery of theater to draw comparison to the nuances of social interaction. The resulting theory of social interaction is called the dramaturgical model of social life. Goffman likens people taking part in social interactions to actors on a stage, taking part in various social roles. When in front stage, the actors are able to see an audience and the audience's expectations as to the roles that they should play, and that influences the actor's behavior. This audience can vary based upon the setting, the location and context where the interaction takes place. Meanwhile, while backstage, individuals can release this role or identity. In a reframing of this, you're on the stage when you're interacting with other people or people that you don't feel very close with, and you are less on the stage with people that you're close with, and you're not on the stage when you're alone. When you're alone, you get to act as yourself, unless you're like me and you constantly feel like you're being perceived, and then you can't do that either, but it's fine. Anyways, in essence, people acting front stage are undergoing a constant process of impression management. Individuals give meaning to themselves, to others, and their situation through performance. The appearance portrays a performer's social statuses, and manner refers to how the individual themselves plays the role, and whether or not it contradicts with their appearance. In this view, Goffman likens people taking part in social interactions to actors on a stage, taking part in various social roles. I think this example is quite fitting for neurodivergent individuals, and it reminds me a lot of the idea of masking. Symbolic interactionism. Society. Symbols. Establish meanings. Develop their views. Communicate with each other. Society. Symbols. In the context of symbolic interactionism, humans define themselves in the context of their social interactions from the time that they are born. For example, children may learn that crying will bring a response from caregivers. While Cooley is widely considered to be part of the symbolic interactionist school, whether Goffman is, on virtue of his open scorn of symbolic interactionism and his emphasis on situational and structural constraints over the motives of actors as a basis for his behavior, is debated. However, some scholars, such as Sheff, argue that Goffman does follow the symbolic interactionist tradition, particularly when he shifts from structuralism, which is the conceit of the stage, the actors, and the audience, to the motivations of the actors. So it's less just about the setup and also about the inside of the actor's brain. For instance, in Goffman's chapter on impression management, he attempts to describe actors' attempts to stave off and manage embarrassment and related emotions. In an attempt to stave off embarrassment and rejection, as well as shame, many people who deviate from societal norms do end up suppressing many aspects of their identity that can bring on these negative social emotions. In particular, just speaking from my own experiences, AMAB individuals. Stereotypes and labeling. Rahim, 2010, examined Cooley's 1922 theory of the looking-glass self in the context of people living in inner-city ghettos. People living in so-called ghettos are ascribed a negative stereotype that often leads people to thinking poorly of themselves and their opportunities, leading in turn to individuals engaging in harmful and dangerous opportunities in the community. Rahim argues that under this theory, individuals who are stereotyped will come to integrate society's label of them as their identity, and will subsequently reproduce that identity's behaviors. As a result, Rahim argues, individuals living in ghettos are more likely to participate in behaviors such as homicide, robbery, and more likely to be barred from job opportunities and education. Here, Rahim draws attention to how poor public perception of a group of people can negatively impact that group. He gives the example of people living in the ghettos, and he says that they will hold the perceptions of others as a way to describe their own identity and that they will internalize what they are told. In addition to this, there are some real-world implications that come with these labels. For example, people living in ghettos are more likely to be poverty-stricken, and increased poverty is also correlated with increased rates of crime. And the reason that increased poverty is associated with crime is due to poverty being punished by the oppressing class, which is the rich people. Felsen found that projection was an important part of actively constructing reflected appraisals. People who believe that they are competent are more likely to believe that others see them as competent. Rosenberg proposes 4 other factors as having effects on reflected appraisals: someone's awareness of reflected appraisals, their agreement with them, the personal relevance that these appraisals have, and their interpersonal significance. For example, people might suppress negative feelings from others to avoid conflict, particularly when one party has significantly more power than the other. These self-appraisals can also be limited by communication barriers and styles, and that there are certain circumstances, such as when self-evaluation is ambiguous, where the perceived responses of others are more aligned with their actual responses. To summarize, the relationship and alignment between the perceived and actual responses of others is heavily dependent on the context, and people generally select whose responses do and do not matter to them. According to Cooley, people learn to use the looking glass and thus learn who the self is through primary groups such as the family. Primary groups are characterized by intimate, face-to-face association and cooperation. TLDR, Felsen found that your idea of who you are will extend to your projections of what you believe that others think about you. Rosenberg suggests that there are 4 other factors that have an effect on the way that you create this projection: your awareness of the way that others think of you, whether or not you agree with their thoughts, how relevant their thoughts are to you, and how close you are to that person. For example, a parent might hold more weight than a stranger on the street. A best friend might hold more weight than a random stranger on the street. In line with this, sometimes people might suppress negative feelings about others to avoid conflict, especially when there's a power imbalance. Some examples that come to mind may be dealing with bigotry, misogyny, etc. from family members because they're blood, especially while you're still living under them as a minor or relying on them financially, for health insurance, for shelter and food, etc. Even just for emotional well-being. This also applies to friend groups. People will suppress negative feelings about others' actions in order to maintain friendships and not be alone. In addition, according to Cooley, people learn to use this looking glass through primary groups, like the family. I would argue that this can negatively impact an individual due to negative perceptions about certain things, such as genderqueer individuals or same-sex attraction. A critical evaluation shows that research has consistently supported Cooley's idea that people act based upon the perceptions they have of how others perceive them, rather than their actual responses. Felsen studied a series of football players and primary school students and found that the relationship between the perceived responses of others and the actual responses of others was reciprocal. However, the former was more important to individual action than the latter. Basically, Felsen found that the anticipated response from others was more important to a football player, primary school student, than the actual response, and that this was backed up by a number of studies. They are primary in several senses, but chiefly in that they are fundamental to forming the social nature and ideals of individuals. What I'm reading is that, depending on the family and primary group that you were born into, you will pick up on the ideals and attitudes of that group, and they will influence you for the entirety of your life. Gender socialization throughout life, from Leslie Edu. Gender socialization is a lifelong process. The beliefs about gender that we acquire in childhood can affect us throughout our lives. The impact of this socialization can be big, such as shaping what we believe we are capable of accomplishing and thus potentially determining our life's course. Small, such as influencing the color we choose for our bedroom walls, or somewhere in the middle. As adults, our beliefs about gender may grow more nuanced and flexible, but gender socialization still affects our behavior, whether in school, the workplace, or our relationships. Primary agents of gender socialization. What influences gender socialization? Parents. Parents are typically a child's first source of information about gender. Starting at birth, parents communicate different expectations to their children depending on their sex. For example, a son may engage in more roughhousing with his father, while a mother takes her daughter shopping. The child may learn from their parent that certain activities or toys correspond with a particular gender. Think of a family that gives their son a truck and their daughter a doll. Even parents who emphasize gender equality may inadvertently reinforce some stereotypes due to their own gender socialization. Teachers. Teachers and school administrators model gender roles and sometimes demonstrate gender stereotypes by responding to male and female students in different ways. For example, separating students by gender for activities or disciplining students differently depending on their gender may reinforce children's developing beliefs and assumptions. Peers. Peer interactions also contribute to gender socialization. Children tend to play with same-gender peers. Through these interactions, they learn what their peers expect of them as boys or girls. These lessons may be direct, such as when a peer tells the child that a certain behavior is or is not appropriate for their gender. They can also be indirect, such as the child observes same and other gendered peers' behavior over time. These comments and comparisons may become less overt over time, but adults continue to turn to same-gendered peers for information about how they are supposed to look and act as a man or woman. Media. Media, including movies, TVs, and books, teaches children about what it means to be a boy or a girl. Media conveys information about the role of a gender in people's lives and can reinforce gender stereotypes. For example, consider an animated film that depicts two female characters, a beautiful but passive heroine and an ugly but active villain. This media model, and countless others, reinforces ideas about which behaviors are acceptable and valued, and which are not for a particular gender.
Makes it possible for someone to start out just wanting to build some muscle or learn how to talk to girls or searching for their favorite anime character and end up arguing for things like enforced monogamy, sex redistribution, or that women should be denied the right to vote. Like most social ills, the worst parts of the Manosphere stem from a very valid and very universal sense of anguish in men. And we have to contend with and process this.
From a young age, we're told that boys will be boys and girls will be girls.
Drive to anatomy, and there's plenty of people who don't fit into either category. Our ideal man and woman are fictions, and they're constantly breaking down. We know of women who prefer swords and sports, and men who prefer dresses and poetry. For Butler, gender is performative. We act it out every day in our mannerisms, our speech and our thoughts. And when we act it out, we're not just putting on a show. We're consolidating and actively constructing these gender identities. Gender is not just an identity, it's a ritual. If gender is performative, then perhaps our best course of action is to refuse to perform differently, or even laugh at it. When we refuse to perform our gender script, the neat binary between men and women starts to fall apart.
Honestly, I recommend you watch this whole video. It's gold. It's only like 4 minutes, but I'll play a few clips here. Gender roles. As we grow, we learn how to behave from those around us. In this socialization process, children are introduced to certain roles that are typically linked to their biological sex. The term gender role refers to society's concept of how people are expected to look and behave based on societally created norms for masculinity and femininity. In U.S. culture, masculine roles are usually associated with strength, aggression, and dominance, while feminine roles are usually associated with passivity, nurturing, and subordination. Gender role socialization begins at birth and continues throughout the life course. Thus, gender, like race, is a social construction with very real consequences. The drive to adhere to masculine and feminine gender roles continues later in life. Men tend to outnumber women in professions such as law enforcement, the military, and politics. Women tend to outnumber men in care-related professions such as childcare, healthcare, even though the term doctor still conjures the image of a man, and social work. These occupational roles are examples of typical U.S. male and typical female behavior derived from our culture's traditions.
Okay, I'm just editing this. After this video, I highly recommend you check out this one. I think it's What Am I, My Culture, or Myself? But I think that's a good video for you to watch next. And then you should just watch the rest of the playlist. So, thanks. Love you. Thanks for watching this one. Bye.